We're going to move on to round 4. This is, again, is a question from a member of the National Union of Healthcare Workers. It's from Alex Sanchez. She is an ultrasound technologist in Napa, and she says, I work at Queen of the Valley Medical Center. She says that our hospital has violated labor laws and refused to recognize the results of a union election for more than 400 employees. She says right now there's a court injunction against the hospital while a new state law attempts to curb similar violations of employees' rights by car makers. This is important. She's drawing a parallel to a new state law attempts to curb violations of employees' rights by car makers. She is asking, can such a law be constructed for healthcare workers? Do you support the legislation on car makers? Second, would you work with us to develop similar legislation requiring hospitals to treat their workers fairly in order to qualify for state subsidies? Again, on the car makers, to get rebates, they have to be certified as fair and responsible in the treatment of workers. So the question is, would a parallel first of all, you support that law for, did you support that law for car makers? Would you support similar legislation for healthcare workers? And that question is going first to Antonia Villaraigosa.
I wasn't in the legislature and wasn't asked about the law, but I would support that law. And I would support a law that requires the same of hospitals. I mean, this is in the interest, you talked earlier about the enlightened self-interest of a company. This should be in the enlightened self-interest of healthcare providers, that they're providing that healthcare in an appropriate way, that they're allowing their employees to organize in a country and a state where you have the right to organize and collectively bargain. When you've won an election, you ought to have the results that come with winning that election. And yes, I would support both pieces of legislation.
Thank you. John Chung.
Yeah, I would hold the hospitals and healthcare providers accountable. I've been in the middle of negotiations where I bring people together to have discussions about how we negotiate differences. And when you identify violations, making sure that both parties identified and that they call it straight. Not only in this particular regard, but when I served on the Board of Equalization and Controller, many of you understand that there's questions about hospitals and the amount of charitable care that they provide. When I get there, I want to make sure that we provide clear definitions so that if you can get subsidized by the state or other types of entities, you're actually providing the care that's promised to the individual. So yes, I would hold the hospitals accountable. And so not only on that particular regard, but also, as I mentioned, on the financial positions.
And John, did you support the legislation in regard to automakers?
I serve as state treasurer, so it doesn't come before me, but I do support it.
You know, I mean, in principle,
yes.
Did you support it? Okay, thank you. And the question now moves to Delane Easton.
Well, I mean, obviously, I support both pieces of legislation. This is a right that workers in California need to have. And I wouldn't just sit in the office and say we're for them quietly. I would be out there marching as the governor, marching with the union to say this hospital has to play by the rules. That's who we are. We play by the rules. They had a vote. They voted overwhelmingly to be unionized, and by God, the hospital ought to have to negotiate with them. It's really time, yeah. And I will just say to all of you, you know, I know what it's like to be in a union family when it goes on strike. I know what it's like to live pretty close to the vest in terms of finances. Thank God for American labor, but we have to grow American labor because there are way too many people right now living on the margins because we're not paying a living wage. I stand with you. I always have. I always will. Check my record.
I think we're all on the same page as it relates to the legislation and the sentiments. And it really underscores a fundamental point about the world we're living in. You can't be passive anymore. You can't wait for, I mean, as a governor, you can't wait for things to land on your desk. You can't wait for labor issues to work themselves out. You need to shape things. I mean, there's an old adage, right? The future's not in front of you, it's inside of you. You got to manifest it. You know, few unions understand that better than you. You got to make it so. It's right decisions. And so what you need is the kind of support and advocacy of people with that experience, that background, to shape solutions to these vexing problems, and I'm committed to being that person. I also am committed to helping the folks up in Napa recover, and the folks up in Sonoma recover from these fires. I had the privilege and burden of being up there for 3 days. It is jaw-dropping, and the challenges up there are now even made more acute, not just at the hospital, but for an entire community and a workforce that have been displaced from their homes and don't have any real
Gavin,
confidence they can get back.
that's off point. I just need to point out.
Respectfully, the fires, I think, directly impacted the hospital, and so substantively, I think it's
All right,
worthy
that's
of
a nice
consideration.
pivot, but I want to point out that it's a pivot.
If you were up there, I mean it.
I'm not disputing it's there, but
it's very heartfelt.
Just in
And
terms of
actually,
keeping things on
in
topic
fairness-
here.
In fairness to him, you did say the person was from Napa.
Oh, okay. I back off. When a point is scored against the moderator,
We're all getting along here. I
the
love it.
moderator must admit that that was a well-scored point, and you were well within your. So
Warned nonetheless, I get it.
you got quite a wingman. I want to take to the point we were just discussing. It seems like there's virtually no daylight between the four of you on the topic that we just discussed. But Bob Butler mentioned before, how do you persuade the people across the street? But the concept of the question of embedding in law penalties for private enterprises if they don't abide by make concessions and embed them in law that support labor. As you know, it's very popular in this room, but it would be abhorrent to many in the private sector. Not all, but many in the private sector. And my question is, do you need at all to change minds on that? Or do you just need to get the votes to get it through and force it through? Or do you actually think there's a process of trying to change minds on that?
Part of leading is changing the minds on that. I think we've talked, a number of us have talked about the enlightened self-interest of employers in the private sector, in this case specifically around healthcare, of providing for the right to organize collective bargaining. But importantly, this union hasn't just been about wages and and the like and pensions. They've been about patient care, protecting patient care. They've been on the front lines of making mental health parity a reality and not just a vision statement. And so I do think you have to convince people of doing that, using a carrot and a stick. And I do believe you're right, that as much as possible, you need to bring people together around the notion that this is in everybody's interest.
John Chung, do you think that's a doable thing, especially in the climate we're living in today?
Yeah, absolutely. The corporate boards, corporations aren't homogenous, right? When I engage in negotiations, trying to bring the parties together, I will find differences amongst the members of the leadership for major hospital entities, for major businesses. Something else that Bob referenced, I want to take a different tack is how do we address. Since I've been a CalPERS CalSTRS board member, I've aggressively worked to change the faces of private sector leadership, right? So we have to make sure that corporate boards understand the conditions that people work in, that they represent the diverse communities. So in my second year in office as the state controller, I push for more people of color on corporate boards, right? This is an international world. When you think about California, 40% Latino, 38% Caucasian, 16% Asian, 6.5% African American, and the rest of the United States of America. This is an incredibly diverse country, very diverse state. I push for more women on corporate boards. I push for more members of the LGBTIQ community representatives on corporate boards. I push for more people with climate change expertise. So not only does it have to emanate from public rule, public policy, we need moral and business leadership that are going to push forward these changes in policies.
And Delane, I'm particularly interested to hear how you answer this question in terms of wanting to persuade and win over people who don't hold the view. Because earlier you got an applause line, well, let's make them hurt, and that would work. But this is a different dynamic. Can you persuade people to come over to your side, or is it a lost cause?
No, I think we can persuade people to come over our side, but you heard the line, fish stinks from the head. We really need leaders in this state to actually profile the real issues that are facing California. When I was superintendent of public instruction for the state, I challenged the governor to reduce class size in kindergarten through third grade. That was my concept. Because I'd gone from a classroom in San Francisco, a public school with 44 kids, down to San Carlos where I was the 20th kid. Teacher in San Francisco was good, the one in San Carlos was good, but one had 44 and one had 20, duh. So at the end of the day, when Pete Wilson wouldn't go along, I sued him. And we won the lawsuit, and we did class size reduction in kindergarten through third grade. So
how are you telling me that you can persuade, how is this telling me that you can persuade people?
You try to persuade people, and if you don't persuade them, you sue them if you have to.
Okay.
You do what you have to do to get the job done.
Gavin Newsom, let's take the question to you.
It's hard to follow that. But no, look, I think it's not lost on any of us standing up here that we're in the midst
And let's not bail on this one. I want to give Gavin time.
I'll be brief, but most folks in this room, look, you get this, and I think it's back to this notion of enlightened self-interest as it relates to the hospitals and it relates to the private sector to work collaboratively and to give workers a voice, and that's what your union's about. And look, the power of emulation, the most successful models integrate workers' voices, integrate a framework of kind of collaboration and partnership that ultimately allows the private sector to thrive, higher productivity, better workforce satisfaction. Those are the most successful business models. And so from a persuasion, and that's your question, from a prospect of persuasion, you have to share those examples and offer those up as alternatives to not treating workers fairly and not treating unions in a respectful or legal manner. And final point, when it comes to public money, absolutely we have the right to inject accountability and hold folks accountable. And when it comes to health care, there's no greater form of public subsidy than the issue of health insurance.
Thank you. That concludes our fourth round of questions. Now we're on to round 5, and